The autumn of 1887 brought more than just golden leaves to the Montana Territory. It brought a desperate mother and her young daughter to the doorstep of the most successful cattle rancher in 3 counties, a man whose own heart had been broken by loss, yet who would soon discover that sometimes helping others heal is the only way to mend your own shattered soul. What began as a simple act of kindness would uncover buried secrets, test the limits of human compassion, and prove that the greatest treasures aren't always made of gold and silver. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Yellowstone Valley like a shroud as Margaret Chun struggled to position her mother's wheelchair on the uneven wooden planks of their makeshift porch. At 19, Margaret had shoulders that bore responsibilities far beyond her years, and hands that had grown rough from work that should have belonged to grown men twice her age. "Mama, can you see the sunrise from there?" Margaret asked softly, adjusting the quilted blanket around her mother's frail legs. Elizabeth Chun's once vibrant brown eyes turned toward the eastern horizon where golden light painted the Montana peaks in breathtaking splendor. "Beautiful as always, sweetheart," Elizabeth whispered, though Margaret noticed how her mother's voice had grown weaker over the past months. The accident at the copper mine 18 months ago had taken more than just Elizabeth's ability to walk. It had slowly been stealing her spirit, one difficult day at a time. Their small cabin sat on the outskirts of Copper Creek, a mining town that had seen better days. What had once been a booming community filled with optimistic prospectors and hardworking families had gradually declined as the easily accessible copper deposits were exhausted. Now most of the able-bodied men had moved on to more promising territories, leaving behind a scattered collection of aging miners, struggling widows, and families too poor or too stubborn to abandon their claims. Margaret surveyed their property with the practical eye of someone who had learned to assess every resource and liability. The cabin needed roof repairs before winter. Their small vegetable garden had produced barely enough to supplement their dwindling food stores, and the few chickens they kept provided eggs only sporadically. Most pressing of all, their savings had been depleted by medical expenses and the specialized wheelchair that had cost more than Margaret earned in 3 months of taking in laundry and mending. "The Henderson boy came by yesterday while you were resting," Margaret said, settling into the wooden chair beside her mother's wheelchair. "He mentioned that the big rancher down in Sweetwater Valley might be hiring help for the winter season." Elizabeth's expression tightened with the familiar mixture of pride and concern that appeared whenever their financial situation was discussed directly. "Margaret, you've done enough. I won't have you working yourself to death because of my condition." "Mama, we've talked about this," Margaret replied gently but firmly. "Taking care of each other isn't a burden, it's what families do. Besides, I'm strong enough to handle whatever work needs doing." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats on the dirt road that connected their cabin to the main thoroughfare leading to Copper Creek. Margaret rose from her chair, shading her eyes against the morning sun to identify their unexpected visitor. A lone rider approached on a magnificent black gelding, moving with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the saddle. As he drew closer, Margaret could see that he was a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-weathered skin and prematurely gray hair that suggested years of outdoor work. His clothing was practical but well-made, the kind worn by successful ranchers rather than struggling miners. The rider dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat as he approached their porch. His movements were respectful but purposeful, and Margaret noticed that his eyes immediately took in the details of their situation. The wheelchair, the obvious signs of financial strain, and the defensive posture she had unconsciously adopted. "Morning, ladies," he said, his voice carrying the slight drawl common to men who had spent years working cattle across open range. "I'm Daniel Harrison from the Sweetwater Ranch. I hope I'm not intruding, but I heard in town that you folks might be facing some difficulties. Margaret's spine stiffened at what sounded like charity disguised as casual conversation. We're managing just fine, Mr. Harrison. Thank you for your concern, but we don't need assistance. Daniel's expression remained neutral, though something in his eyes suggested he understood her defensiveness. I'm sure you are managing, Miss Chun, Margaret Chun. This is my mother, Elizabeth. Miss Chun, Mrs. Chun, Daniel nodded respectfully to both women. I should clarify, I'm not here to offer charity. I'm here because I genuinely need help, and I was told you might be the right person for the job. Elizabeth leaned forward slightly in her wheelchair, her interest piqued despite her daughter's obvious suspicion. What kind of help, Mr. Harrison? Daniel's attention focused on Elizabeth with the same respectful attention he had shown Margaret. I run a cattle operation that covers about 15,000 acres. It's successful, but it's also isolated. I employ about 20 men year-round, and during winter, they're essentially cut off from civilization for months at a time. What I need is someone who can manage the domestic side of the operation: cooking, cleaning, basic medical care, and general household management for the main ranch house. Margaret felt her heart rate increase despite her efforts to remain skeptical. The job description sounded almost too good to be true, which in her experience usually meant it was exactly that. And you think I'm qualified for this position based on what information? Dr. Williams mentioned that you've been caring for your mother single-handedly since her accident, Daniel replied honestly. He said you've learned basic medical procedures, that you're organized and reliable, and that you handle responsibility well. Those are exactly the qualities I need. Dr. Williams had no right to discuss our private affairs, Margaret said sharply, though she felt a flutter of possibility despite her irritation. He was trying to help, Daniel said mildly. He's concerned about both of you, especially with winter coming. The job comes with living quarters in the main house, full board, and wages of $40 a month. The figure was more than Margaret had dared hope for, representing financial security beyond anything she had imagined possible. But the offer also raised immediate questions about practicality and motivation. What about my mother? Margaret asked directly. She requires constant care and specialized accommodations. Daniel's response surprised both women with its thoughtfulness. The main house has a ground-floor bedroom that would be perfect for someone who uses a wheelchair. Wide doorways, no stairs, and close to the kitchen and main living areas. If Mrs. Chun is willing, she'd be welcome to help with tasks that can be done from a seated position: bookkeeping, menu planning, correspondence, anything that matches her abilities and interests. Elizabeth's eyes brightened for the first time in months. The possibility of being useful rather than simply cared for clearly appealed to her deeply. You'd really want an invalid's help with ranch business? Mrs. Chun, I'd want the help of someone with experience and intelligence, regardless of whether they walk or use a wheelchair, Daniel replied sincerely. From what I understand, you managed household finances and helped run a boarding house before the accident. Those skills would be invaluable. Margaret found herself torn between hope and suspicion. The offer addressed their most pressing needs almost perfectly, but her experience had taught her to be wary of solutions that seemed too convenient. Why us specifically? Surely there are other qualified candidates who don't come with complications. Daniel was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant as he appeared to consider how much to reveal about his motivations. Because I understand what it's like to lose everything and have to rebuild from nothing. And because I believe that people who faced real hardship often make the most dedicated employees. The answer felt honest, though Margaret sensed there were deeper layers to his reasoning that he wasn't ready to share. Before she could formulate her next questions, Elizabeth spoke up with a directness that surprised her daughter. Mr. Harrison, Margaret is proud and protective, which are good qualities that have kept us alive during difficult times. But I'm curious about your operation. What happened to your previous household manager? Daniel's expression grew somber. My wife handled those responsibilities until her death 3 years ago. Since then, I've been managing with a rotating series of temporary arrangements that haven't worked out well. The isolation is challenging for most people, and the work is demanding. The admission revealed a vulnerability that made him seem more human and trustworthy. Margaret realized that his offer might be born of genuine need rather than misplaced. Sympathy. The isolation, Margaret said. How isolated are we talking about? Sweetwater Ranch is about 30 miles from the nearest town, and the roads become impassable during heavy snow, Daniel explained honestly. From December through March, we're essentially self-sufficient. It's beautiful country, but it's not. For everyone, Margaret considered the implications. Isolation that might be imprisonment for some people could be sanctuary for others. Away from the pitying looks and whispered conversations that had become part of daily life in Copper Creek, she and her mother could build new routines and regain their dignity. What would be expected of me specifically? She asked, her tone shifting from defensive to genuinely interested. Meal planning and preparation for the main house, general cleaning and maintenance, basic first aid for minor injuries, and coordination with the seasonal workers when needed, Daniel replied. During calving season and roundups, the work increases, but so does the help available. And my mother? Whatever she's comfortable with and interested in doing. Account management, correspondence, inventory tracking, meal planning, anything. That contributes without creating physical strain. Elizabeth had been listening to this exchange with growing animation. Margaret realized that the prospect of being useful and valued was as appealing to her mother as the financial security was. To herself. When would this position begin? Margaret asked, feeling herself being drawn toward acceptance despite her remaining reservations. As soon as possible, Daniel replied. Winter preparations begin early in this territory, and I'd like to have domestic arrangements settled before the first serious snowfall. Margaret looked at her mother, reading the hope and excitement in Elizabeth's expression. The decision seemed to be making itself, though she wanted to establish clear expectations from the beginning. Mr. Harrison, if we accept your offer, it would be with the understanding that my mother's care comes first. If there's ever a conflict between ranch duties and her needs, she takes priority. I wouldn't expect anything else, Daniel replied immediately. Family obligations always come first. That's not negotiable. The sincerity in his voice convinced Margaret that they were dealing with a man of integrity. But she also sensed that Daniel Harrison carried his own burdens and secrets, just as they carried theirs. We'll need a few days to arrange our affairs here, Margaret said finally. But yes, Mr. Harrison, we accept your offer. Daniel's relief was visible, though he maintained his composed demeanor. Excellent. I'll send a wagon on Friday to help with your belongings. Anything you can't bring immediately can be stored or retrieved later. As Daniel prepared to leave, Elizabeth called out to him one final time. Mr. Harrison, why are you really doing this? And please don't say it's just because you need household help. There's something more. Daniel paused in the act of mounting his horse, turning back to face both women with an expression that revealed more than his words had conveyed. Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild their life after tragedy strikes. And because I've learned that helping others heal is sometimes the only way to heal yourself. With that cryptic statement, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Margaret and Elizabeth to contemplate the dramatic change that was about to transform their circumstances. As they watched Daniel Harrison disappear into the distance, Margaret realized that accepting his offer meant more than simply taking a job. It meant trusting a stranger with their most vulnerable hopes and fears, venturing into unknown territory, both literally and figuratively, and believing that sometimes the help we need arrives in forms we never expected. The weight of mountains had pressed down on their small cabin for 18 months, threatening to crush their spirits along with their bodies. Now, suddenly, those same mountains beckoned as the backdrop for a new chapter in their lives, one that promised dignity, purpose, and perhaps even the possibility of happiness they had thought lost forever. Margaret squeezed her mother's hand. As they sat together on their porch, both women feeling the first stirrings of hope they had experienced since the accident that had changed everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but it would also bring new possibilities. And for the first time in months, the future felt like something to anticipate rather than simply endure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The wagon Daniel Harrison sent arrived precisely at dawn on Friday, driven by a weathered man in his 50s who introduced himself as Samuel Rodriguez, the ranch foreman. His calloused hands and sun-creased face spoke of decades spent working cattle, but his gentle manner with Elizabeth's wheelchair and their modest possessions revealed a kindness that immediately put both women at ease. "Mr. Harrison wanted me to tell you that we've prepared everything at the ranch," Samuel said as he carefully secured Elizabeth's wheelchair in the wagon bed. "The bedroom's been arranged with a hospital bed we borrowed from Doc Patterson in Sweetwater, and we've built a ramp for the front porch." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with gratitude. The level of preparation suggested that Daniel Harrison was serious about making their transition smooth, but it also meant there would be no turning back once they left Copper Creek behind. Their belongings filled barely half the wagon, a sobering reminder of how little they had accumulated during their years of struggle. Elizabeth's medical supplies, Margaret's sewing materials, their few books, and some treasured photographs represented the sum total of their portable possessions. Everything else, the cabin, the garden, their small flock of chickens, would be left to the next desperate family seeking cheap shelter in a declining mining town. As the wagon rolled away from the only home Margaret had known since childhood, she turned for one last look at the cabin that had sheltered them through their darkest period. The structure already appeared abandoned, its empty windows reflecting the morning sun like vacant eyes. But rather than sadness, Margaret felt a surprising surge of liberation. They were leaving behind not just a place, but a chapter of their lives defined by limitation and loss. The journey to Sweetwater Ranch took them through terrain that grew progressively more beautiful as they traveled south from the mining district. Rolling hills covered in autumn grass gave way to dramatic valleys carved by crystal-clear streams, while distant mountain peaks provided a backdrop of stunning grandeur that made Margaret understand why Daniel Harrison had chosen to build his life in such isolation. "First time seeing the territory from this direction?" Samuel asked, noticing Margaret's fascination with the changing landscape. "We rarely traveled far from Copper Creek," Margaret admitted. "After Mama's accident, I couldn't leave her alone for extended periods." Samuel nodded with understanding. Isolation can be a prison or a sanctuary, depending on your circumstances. For some folks, these mountains represent freedom. For others, they feel like walls. Elizabeth had been quiet during the first hour of travel, but now she spoke up with renewed animation. "Samuel, how long have you worked for Mr. Harrison?" "Going on 12 years now," Samuel replied. "Started as a regular ranch hand and worked my way up to foreman. Mr. Harrison's a fair boss, demanding but reasonable. He expects good work, but he takes care of his people." "What's he like as a person?" Margaret asked, realizing she had accepted employment from a man she barely knew. Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "He's a private man who's been through some hard times. Lost his wife and daughter in a typhoid outbreak 3 years back. Since then, he's thrown himself into ranch work like a man trying to outrun his grief." The revelation about Daniel's daughter hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had assumed his wife's death was tragic enough, but losing a child as well explained the deep sadness she had glimpsed beneath his composed exterior. How old was his daughter? Elizabeth asked softly. Little Sarah was only 6, Samuel replied, his voice heavy with remembered sorrow. Sweetest child you ever saw, always following her daddy around the ranch, asking questions about everything. When the fever took her and her mother within a week of each other, it nearly broke him. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she imagined Daniel Harrison's loss. Her own struggle suddenly seemed smaller in comparison to such devastating grief. Is that why he needs household help? Because he can't bear to maintain the family areas of the house? Partly, Samuel acknowledged, but also because he genuinely needs someone to manage things properly. He's been eating beans and hardtack for 3 years, and the house has gotten to be more like a bachelor bunkhouse than a proper home. As they crested a hill overlooking the Sweetwater Valley, Margaret gasped at her first sight of Daniel Harrison's ranch. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure built from local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that suggested both comfort and permanence. Outbuildings spread across several acres included barns, corrals, bunkhouses, and what appeared to be a workshop. Everything was well maintained and prosperous looking, a stark contrast to the declining infrastructure they had left behind in Copper Creek. It's magnificent, Elizabeth breathed, her voice filled with wonder. I had no idea it would be so grand. Mr. Harrison's grandfather started this ranch back in the 1840s, Samuel explained with obvious pride. 3 generations of Harrisons have built it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. They run about 5,000 head across 15,000 acres. The scale of the operation was almost incomprehensible to Margaret, who had grown up thinking that success meant having enough food for the next week and enough coal to keep the cabin warm. The Sweetwater Ranch represented a level of prosperity and stability she had never imagined possible. As their wagon approached the main house, Margaret noticed a man emerge from the barn and begin walking toward them. Even at a distance, Daniel Harrison's tall frame and confident stride were unmistakable. He had shed his formal clothes in favor of working attire: leather chaps, worn boots, and a practical shirt that showed evidence of morning ranch work. Ladies, Daniel called as he approached their wagon. Welcome to Sweetwater Ranch. I hope the journey wasn't too difficult. It was beautiful, Elizabeth replied immediately. Samuel has been an excellent guide and companion. Daniel smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Margaret had seen from him. Samuel knows this country better than anyone. He's been essential to everything we've accomplished here. As Samuel and Daniel worked together to help Elizabeth from the wagon to her wheelchair, Margaret was struck by the easy cooperation between the 2 men. Whatever tensions might exist in Daniel's personal life, he clearly commanded genuine respect and loyalty from his employees. Let me show you the house, Daniel said, pushing Elizabeth's wheelchair toward the front porch where a newly constructed wooden ramp provided smooth access. I hope the modifications meet your needs. The interior of the main house exceeded Margaret's expectations in every way. High ceilings, quality furniture, and large windows created an atmosphere of spacious comfort, while practical details like wide doorways and hardwood floors showed consideration for Elizabeth's mobility requirements. The ground floor bedroom had been arranged with hospital-grade equipment and positioned to provide easy access to both the kitchen and the main living areas. This is wonderful, Mr. Harrison, Elizabeth said, running her hands along the adjustable bed frame. You've thought of everything. I consulted with Dr. Patterson about the best arrangements, Daniel replied. He suggested that comfort and independence were equally important for recovery and well-being. Margaret explored the kitchen with growing excitement. It was equipped with a large cast-iron stove, abundant storage space, and modern conveniences like running water and gas lighting. After years of cooking on a wood-burning stove in their cramped cabin, the facility represented luxury beyond her dreams. The pantry is stocked with basic supplies, Daniel said, following her examination of the workspace. But I'd like you to plan menus based on what you think best rather than trying to accommodate my bachelor preferences. What have you been eating? Margaret asked, genuinely curious. Daniel looked embarrassed. Whatever Samuel's wife sends over when she takes pity on me, plus whatever I can manage not to burn. Elizabeth laughed, the first genuine laughter Margaret had heard from her mother in months. That explains why you look like you've lost weight. We'll have you properly fed within a week. The next hour was spent in practical arrangements, discussing daily routines, reviewing household supplies, and establishing expectations for both work responsibilities and personal boundaries. Daniel proved to be thoughtful and thorough in addressing their concerns, while maintaining the respectful distance appropriate to an employer-employee relationship. There's something else I should mention, Daniel said as they concluded their initial discussions. We have a neighbor situation that requires some diplomatic handling. Margaret's alert expression prompted him to continue. The Whitfield Ranch borders our property to the east. Old man Whitfield has been trying to buy our water rights for years, and he's not particularly scrupulous about his methods. He might approach you with questions about ranch operations, or attempt to gather information through seemingly casual conversation. What kind of information? Elizabeth asked, her business experience making her immediately suspicious of potential espionage. Cattle numbers, grazing patterns, financial arrangements, anything that might give him leverage in future negotiations, Daniel explained. I'm not saying he's dangerous, but he's persistent and manipulative. Margaret nodded her understanding. We'll be discreet about ranch business. Is there anyone else we should be aware of? The banker in Sweetwater, James Morrison, has been pressuring me to expand operations using borrowed capital, Daniel continued. He's been increasingly aggressive about it lately, which makes me suspicious of his motivations. Samuel, who had been quiet during this discussion, finally spoke up. Morrison's been asking questions around town about ranch finances and cattle prices. Could be innocent business interest, but it feels more calculated than that. The warnings painted a picture of external pressures that Margaret hadn't anticipated. The Sweetwater Ranch might be isolated, but it wasn't insulated from the kind of business and political complications that could threaten their newfound security. Is the ranch in any financial difficulty? Elizabeth asked directly, her tone businesslike and concerned. Not at all, Daniel replied immediately. We're profitable and debt-free. But success attracts attention, and not all of it is welcome. As afternoon faded into evening, Margaret prepared their first meal in the ranch kitchen, beef stew with fresh vegetables, cornbread, and apple pie made from fruit preserved in the ranch's own storage cellar. The cooking process felt natural and satisfying in a way that washing other people's laundry never had. Daniel joined them for dinner, eating with obvious appreciation and commenting favorably on every dish. But Margaret noticed that he consistently directed conversation toward ranch operations and their comfort rather than personal topics. The man was clearly determined to maintain professional boundaries, even while showing genuine concern for their welfare. After dinner, as Elizabeth settled into her new bedroom and Margaret organized their belongings, she reflected on the dramatic change in their circumstances. In a single day, they had moved from poverty and isolation to comfort and purpose. The transformation felt almost miraculous, yet she sensed that their story was just beginning. Looking out her bedroom window at the vast expanse of ranch land stretching toward distant mountains, Margaret realized that Sweetwater Ranch represented more than employment. It represented the possibility of rebuilding their lives in ways they had never dared imagine. But she also understood that such opportunities came with responsibilities and risks that would test them in ways they had yet to discover. The weight of mountains no longer pressed down upon them. Instead, those same peaks stood as guardians around their new home, promising protection and permanence if they proved worthy of the trust Daniel Harrison had placed in them. Tomorrow would bring their first full day of work, and with it, the chance to prove that they could contribute as much value as they received. Margaret fell asleep to the sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures and wind whispering through pine trees, the soundtrack of a life that was finally moving forward. Instead of simply surviving, Margaret woke before dawn to the sound of activity. Outside her window boots on wooden planks, quiet voices discussing the day's plans, and the gentle lowing of cattle being moved to fresh pasture. The sounds of a working ranch were foreign but somehow comforting, representing a world of purpose and productivity that stood in sharp contrast to the desperate quiet of their former life. She dressed quickly in her most practical clothing and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Daniel already seated at the large wooden table with account ledgers spread before him, a cup of coffee steaming beside his elbow. He looked up as she entered, and she was struck again by the sadness that seemed permanently etched around his eyes. "Morning, Margaret," he said, closing the ledger with what seemed like relief. "I hope the ranch sounds didn't disturb your sleep." "Not at all," she replied honestly. "How long have you been awake?" "Since 4. Cattle don't respect regular hours, especially during breeding season." Daniel stood, moving to pour her coffee from the pot he'd apparently been nursing. "I wanted to talk with you about something before the day gets too busy." Margaret accepted the coffee gratefully, noting that Daniel had somehow managed to make it strong without making it bitter, a skill that suggested more domestic competence than he claimed to possess. "What is it?" Daniel hesitated, his fingers drumming against the table surface in a gesture that suggested internal conflict. "Yesterday, I mentioned our neighbor Whitfield and some business pressures. What I didn't mention is that there might be some complications arising from your presence here." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. "What kind of complications?" "Whitfield has been spreading rumors around Sweetwater that I'm financially unstable, trying to undermine confidence in the ranch operation," Daniel explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "When word gets out that I've hired household staff, he's likely to claim it's evidence of desperate extravagance or improper behavior." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as she grasped the implications. "He'll suggest there's something inappropriate about our arrangement." "Exactly. And while I don't care what Whitfield thinks personally, I'm concerned about how such rumors might affect you and your mother. Small communities can be harsh in their judgments." The warning was disturbing, but not entirely unexpected. Margaret had lived long enough to understand that women in vulnerable positions were always subject to speculation and criticism, regardless of the actual circumstances. "What do you suggest we do about it?" "Be prepared for gossip and maintain absolute propriety in all our interactions," Daniel replied. "Beyond that, we'll simply have to trust that your character and work will speak for themselves." Elizabeth's voice from the kitchen doorway interrupted their conversation. "Good morning. I hope I'm not intruding on business discussions." "Not at all, Mama," Margaret said, moving quickly to help position her mother's wheelchair at the table. "Mr. Harrison was just explaining some social complexities we might encounter." Elizabeth's sharp eyes moved between Margaret and Daniel, reading the tension in their postures and expressions. "What kind of complexities?" Daniel repeated his explanation about Whitfield's likely reaction to their hiring, speaking with the same careful honesty he had shown Margaret. Elizabeth listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to navigating difficult social situations. "Mr. Harrison," Elizabeth said when he finished, "I spent 15 years running a boarding house in a mining town. I'm quite familiar with how gossip spreads and how to manage it. The key is to be so obviously respectable and competent that criticism becomes ridiculous." "Exactly what I was thinking," Daniel replied, his expression showing relief at Elizabeth's pragmatic response. "Your experience will be invaluable in handling whatever social complications arise." Margaret busied herself preparing breakfast while listening to her mother, and Daniel discussed strategies for maintaining their reputation in the face of potential criticism. She was struck by how naturally they collaborated, their different experiences complementing each other to create comprehensive solutions. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Daniel frowned, checking his pocket watch. 6:30 is early for social calls. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see a well-dressed man on horseback, dismounting with the confident movements of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever he appeared. Even from a distance, his bearing suggested wealth and authority. "That's Morrison, the banker," Daniel said grimly. "This can't be good news." James Morrison proved to be a man in his late 40s with carefully groomed appearance and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He swept into the house with the presumptuous familiarity of someone who considered himself an important figure in territorial society. "Daniel, my boy." Morrison boomed, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more political than friendly. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by so early, but I had some exciting news I wanted to share personally." "James," Daniel replied with polite coolness, accepting the handshake briefly. "What brings you out here at dawn?" Morrison's gaze swept the kitchen, taking in Margaret's presence at the stove and Elizabeth's wheelchair with unconcealed curiosity. "I see you've made some domestic improvements. Very wise to maintain proper household arrangements." The comment carried implications that made Margaret's skin crawl, though she maintained her composure while continuing to prepare breakfast. She noticed that Daniel's jaw tightened at Morrison's presumptuous tone. "These are Mrs. Elizabeth Chun and her daughter Margaret, my new household manager," Daniel said formally. "Ladies, James Morrison from the Sweetwater Bank." "Charmed," Morrison sighed, though his attention immediately returned to Daniel. "I have a proposition that could transform your operation into the largest cattle enterprise in the territory." Daniel's expression grew wary. "I'm not interested in expansion loans, James. We've discussed this before. But this is different," Morrison exclaimed, his enthusiasm seeming forced. "I have investors from back east who are specifically looking for established operations to fund. They're prepared to advance significant capital based on your proven track record." "How significant?" Elizabeth asked suddenly, her business instincts engaged despite the social awkwardness of the situation. Morrison turned to her with surprise, apparently having dismissed her as irrelevant to business discussions. "I beg your pardon? How much capital are your investors prepared to advance, and under what terms?" Elizabeth repeated with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to financial negotiations. Daniel looked equally surprised by Elizabeth's intervention, but also impressed by her directness. Morrison, however, seemed taken aback by having to justify his proposition to a woman in a wheelchair. "Well, that would depend on various factors," Morrison said evasively. "Property valuations, cattle assessments, growth projections. Standard business considerations," Elizabeth agreed pleasantly. "What interest rates are being offered and what collateral would be required?" Margaret watched this exchange with fascination, realizing that her mother possessed business acumen that had been dormant during their years of struggle, but was now reasserting itself in response to professional challenge. Morrison's discomfort was becoming obvious. "Perhaps we should discuss the details privately, Daniel. These are complex financial matters that require—" "Mrs. Chun has considerable experience with business finances," Daniel interrupted firmly. "If she's interested in the discussion, she's welcome to participate." The support for Elizabeth was clearly genuine, and Margaret felt a surge of gratitude toward their employer for recognizing her mother's capabilities rather than dismissing them because of her disability. Morrison recovered his composure with visible effort. "Of course. The investors are prepared to advance up to $50,000 at 12% annual interest, secured by ranch property and cattle assets." Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath was audible. Margaret didn't fully understand the implications, but she could tell from both Elizabeth's and Daniel's expressions that the terms were either very good or very bad. 12% is highway robbery," Elizabeth said bluntly. "Current market Rates for secured agricultural loans are 7%, 8 at most. Morrison's smile became strained. These are high-risk frontier investments, Mrs. Chun. The rates reflect the associated uncertainties. Mr. Harrison's operation is hardly high risk, Elizabeth countered. 12 years of consistent profitability, debt-free status, and prime. Grazing land represent about as secure an investment as exists in the territory. Daniel was watching this exchange with growing appreciation for Elizabeth's financial knowledge and growing suspicion of Morrison's motives. James, what's the real purpose behind this offer? You've never shown interest in helping ranchers expand before. Morrison's composure finally cracked slightly. There are opportunities arising that could benefit all of us. Market conditions are changing, and forward-thinking operators need to position themselves advantageously. What opportunities specifically? Margaret found herself asking, her protective instincts aroused by Morrison's evasive manner. Railroad development, territorial statehood, federal land policies, Morrison replied vaguely. Smart investors are preparing for significant changes. Elizabeth leaned forward in her wheelchair, her expression intent. Mr. Morrison, in my experience, when bankers become aggressively generous, it's usually because they know something their customers don't. What exactly do you know about upcoming changes that would make rapid expansion urgent? The question hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated stove. Morrison's expression cycled through surprise, annoyance, and what might have been concern before settling on forced joviality. Mrs. Chun, you have a suspicious mind, he said with a laugh that sounded hollow. Sometimes an opportunity is simply an opportunity. And sometimes it's a trap, Elizabeth replied pleasantly. Mr. Harrison, I would strongly advise against any financial arrangements until you've had time to research these mysterious market changes independently. Daniel nodded slowly, his respect for Elizabeth's business judgment clearly established. Sound advice. James, I appreciate your offer, but I'm not interested in expansion loans at this time. Morrison's facade finally dropped completely, revealing frustration and something that might have been desperation. Daniel, you're making a mistake. These opportunities won't remain available indefinitely. Then I'll accept responsibility for missing them, Daniel replied firmly. Was there anything else you needed to discuss? The dismissal was polite, but unmistakable. Morrison gathered his composure with visible effort, returning to his practiced charm while preparing to leave. Of course. But if you reconsider, don't wait too long. Some opportunities have expiration dates. After Morrison's departure, the kitchen fell silent except for the sounds of Margaret finishing breakfast preparations. The encounter had revealed undercurrents that none of them fully understood, but all recognized as potentially threatening. That man is up to something, Elizabeth said finally. 12% interest rates and pressure for immediate decisions are classic signs of predatory lending. But why target our ranch specifically? Daniel asked. There are larger operations. That would represent bigger profits. Margaret set plates of food before them, her mind working through the implications of what they had witnessed. Maybe it's not about profit. Maybe it's about control or access to something specific. The water rights, Daniel said suddenly, understanding dawning in his expression. Whitfield's been trying to buy our water rights for years. If he could get Morrison to pressure us into default... He could acquire the property through foreclosure, Elizabeth finished. Much cheaper than fair market purchase, and legally bulletproof. The conspiracy they had uncovered was both simpler and more dangerous than any of them had initially realized. Their isolated ranch wasn't just successful, it was a target. And their newfound security depended on staying ahead of enemies who possessed both patience and ruthless determination. As they ate breakfast in thoughtful silence, Margaret realized that their journey to Sweetwater Ranch had brought them not just opportunity, but also into the middle of a conflict that could destroy everything they hoped to build. The mountains around them were no longer just guardians. they were also walls that could trap them if their enemies proved more clever than they were cautious. The shadows of the past weren't just Daniel's personal grief. They were also the accumulated schemes of people who saw the ranch's success as something to be exploited rather than celebrated. And now, whether they wanted it or not, Margaret and Elizabeth were part of that fight. 2 weeks had passed since Morrison's unwelcome visit, and Margaret had settled into a rhythm at Sweetwater Ranch that felt more natural than anything she had experienced in years. Her days began before sunrise with preparations for the ranch hand's breakfast, continued through household management and meal planning, and ended with quiet evenings spent in conversation with Daniel and her mother about everything from cattle breeding to territorial politics. What surprised her most was how Daniel had begun seeking her opinion on matters beyond household management. During their evening discussions, he would outline challenges facing the ranch operation and genuinely listen to her suggestions, treating her insights with the same respect he showed Samuel's expertise or her mother's business acumen. This particular morning brought an unexpected complication that would test the trust they had been building. Margaret was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed, not the measured pace of ranch business, but the urgent rhythm of emergency or pursuit. She dropped the sheet she had been pinning and hurried around to the front of the house, where she found Daniel emerging from the barn with his rifle in hand, his expression alert and concerned. 6 riders were approaching across the valley floor, their horses lathered with sweat that suggested they had been traveling hard for considerable distance. "Samuel!" Daniel called to his foreman, who appeared from the equipment shed with several ranch hands behind him. "Get the men positioned and ready, but keep weapons out of sight unless I signal otherwise." Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she recognized the organized nature of Daniel's response. This wasn't the first time Sweetwater Ranch had faced potential trouble, and everyone seemed to know their role in handling whatever threat might be approaching. As the riders drew closer, Margaret could see that they wore the uniforms of territorial marshals, but their numbers and urgency suggested something more serious than routine business. The lead rider was a tall man with a distinctive gray mustache who dismounted with the fluid movements of someone comfortable taking charge of Eniel Harrison. The marshal called, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with official authority. "I'm Harrison," Daniel replied, setting his rifle aside but keeping it within easy reach. "What brings you to Sweetwater Ranch, Marshal?" "Patterson." "Federal Marshal Patterson," the man replied, his gaze taking in the assembled ranch hands and the defensive positioning Daniel had arranged. "We're pursuing a group of bank robbers who hit the First National in Helena 3 days ago. Trail leads through this area." Margaret felt relief wash over her as she realized this wasn't about the ranch's business conflicts, but she noticed that Daniel remained tense and alert. Something about the marshal's manner or the situation didn't feel entirely straightforward. "Bank robbers," Daniel repeated. "How many men? And what makes you think they came this direction?" "4 men, well-mounted and well-armed," Marshal Patterson replied. "They were seen heading south through Copper Creek yesterday morning. Local sheriff suggested they might be making for the mountain passes to escape into Wyoming territory." The mention of Copper Creek sent a chill through Margaret. The fugitives had passed through her former home, possibly endangering people she had known and cared about. But more immediately concerning was the realization that the robbers' route would have brought them very close to Sweetwater Ranch. "We haven't seen any strangers in the area," Daniel said honestly. "But if they're heading for the passes, they'd likely avoid the main ranch buildings and stick to the high country trails." Marshal Patterson nodded, consulting a hand-drawn map. "That's what we figured. Mind if we water our horses and rest them for an hour? We've been pushing hard since dawn, and we'll need fresh mounts to follow them into the mountains." "Of course," Daniel replied, his natural hospitality overriding his suspicions. "Samuel will show you to the water troughs. Margaret, could you prepare food for the marshal's party?" As Margaret hurried toward the house to begin meal preparations, she heard Marshal Patterson speaking in lower tones to Daniel about the robbery. Details. Apparently, the thieves had taken over $8,000 and killed a bank guard during their escape crimes that would result in hanging. If they were captured, Elizabeth was waiting in the kitchen when Margaret arrived, her expression troubled. "Those men don't feel right to me," she said without preamble. "Something about their manner suggests they're not what they claim to be." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though she had felt similar unease about the marshal's party. "Watch their eyes," Elizabeth instructed. "Real lawmen pursuing dangerous criminals are focused and purposeful. These men keep looking around like they're assessing the ranch's defenses and resources rather than tracking fugitives." Margaret busied herself preparing a substantial meal while processing her mother's observations. Elizabeth's instincts about people had been honed by years of running a boarding house where the ability to quickly assess guests' character and intentions was essential for survival. Through the kitchen window, Margaret could observe the marshal's party as they tended their horses and conversed in small groups. Their behavior did seem more exploratory than focused, as though they were gathering intelligence rather than simply resting during a pursuit. "Mama," Margaret said quietly, "do you think they're actually the bank robbers?" Elizabeth's expression grew grave. "That's exactly what I'm wondering. What better way to scout a prosperous ranch than to arrive as lawmen, pursuing imaginary criminals?" The possibility was terrifying but logical. If Elizabeth's suspicions were correct, they were harboring dangerous criminals who were probably assessing the ranch's wealth and defenses while enjoying its hospitality. And Daniel was treating them as honored guests rather than potential threats. Margaret made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks earlier. Leaving the meal preparations, she walked purposefully toward where Daniel was conversing with Marshal Patterson near the main corral. As she approached, she heard the marshal asking detailed questions about the ranch's cattle numbers and seasonal routines, information that seemed irrelevant to tracking fugitives. "Mr. Harrison," Margaret interrupted with apparent casualness, "could I speak with you about the supply inventory? There's a discrepancy I need to clarify before I can complete the meal preparations." Daniel looked surprised by the interruption, but excused himself from the conversation and followed Margaret toward the house. Once they were out of earshot, Margaret spoke urgently and quietly. "Daniel, my mother thinks those men might not be real marshals. Their behavior seems more like scouting than pursuing, and they're asking questions about ranch operations that have nothing to do with catching bank robbers." Daniel's expression immediately became alert and focused. "What specifically has Elizabeth noticed?" "They're assessing our defenses and resources rather than following a trail. And the timing is suspicious, showing up just days after Morrison's visit, when we know there's a conspiracy to acquire this ranch." Daniel was quiet for a moment, his mind clearly working through the implications. If they're not marshals, they could be advanced scouts for a larger gang, or they could be planning to rob us directly. "Either way, we're in danger," Margaret said. "What do we do?" "We continue playing host while I verify their credentials," Daniel decided. "Can you delay serving the meal for another 30 minutes? Margaret nodded, understanding that Daniel needed time to investigate without arousing the imposter's suspicions. As she returned to the house, she noticed that several of the marshals were now exploring areas of the ranch that were clearly beyond what would be necessary for resting horses. Elizabeth was waiting anxiously in the kitchen. "Well, Daniel's checking their credentials," Margaret reported. "We need to delay the meal and be ready for trouble." "How do we prepare for trouble when we're outnumbered and outgunned?" Elizabeth asked practically. Margaret considered their options. The ranch hands were loyal to Daniel, but they were cattlemen, not gunfighters. Samuel was competent and trusted, but 6 armed men represented overwhelming odds in any direct confrontation. "Maybe we don't fight them," Margaret said suddenly. "Maybe we outsmart them." "How?" Margaret's mind was racing through possibilities when she heard Daniel's voice from the front porch, speaking in tones that carried clearly through the house. "Marshal Patterson, I've sent a rider to verify your credentials with the territorial office in Helena. Standard procedure when armed groups request hospitality." The response was immediate and telling. Instead of appreciation for proper procedure, Margaret heard angry voices and what sounded like the drawing of weapons. Through the window, she could see that the situation had deteriorated rapidly, with the fake marshals now openly threatening Daniel and the ranch hands. "Well, that settles it," Elizabeth said grimly. "They're definitely not lawmen." The crisis had arrived with stunning suddenness. The men who had posed as federal marshals were now holding Daniel at gunpoint while their companions secured the ranch hands and began systematically looting the main buildings. Margaret realized that their comfortable new life was about to be destroyed by the same kind of violence and desperation they had hoped to escape forever. But as she watched Daniel maintain his composure even under direct threat, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since her father's death: the presence of a man worthy of trust and loyalty. Whatever happened next, she was determined to prove herself worthy of the faith Daniel had shown in hiring them. "Mama," she said quietly, "remember what you taught me about reading people's weaknesses?" Elizabeth nodded, her own expression becoming determined despite their desperate circumstances. "Time to use everything we've learned about survival," Margaret continued. "These men think they're dealing with helpless victims. Let's show them how wrong they are." The fake marshals had made a critical error in underestimating both the resourcefulness of the people they threatened and the strength of loyalty that Daniel Harrison had inspired through years of fair dealing and genuine kindness. They were about to discover that some treasures, trust, courage, and family bonds were worth fighting for regardless of the odds. As Margaret began implementing a desperate plan to turn the tables on their captors, she realized that this crisis would either destroy everything they had built at Sweetwater Ranch or forge bonds strong enough to withstand any future challenge. The choice between surrender and resistance had already been made. Now they would discover whether their courage was equal to their convictions. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as the real test of their new family began, not with words or promises, but with actions that would define who they really were when everything they cared about hung in the balance. Margaret's plan began with the simple recognition that desperate men often overlooked the capabilities of those they considered powerless. The fake marshals had dismissed Elizabeth as a helpless invalid and Margaret as a frightened domestic worker, assumptions that would prove to be their fatal mistake. "Listen carefully, Mama," Margaret whispered as she moved around the kitchen, with apparent nervousness, actually positioning supplies for what she hoped would be their salvation. "Remember the boarding house fire in Denver? How you organized the bucket brigade while everyone else panicked?" Elizabeth's eyes sharpened with understanding. Despite her physical limitations, she possessed organizational skills and crisis management, experience that could turn chaos into coordinated action. "What do you need me to do?" "Get to the root cellar," Margaret instructed quietly. "The entrance is through the pantry floor. Once you're safely hidden, count to exactly 300, then create the loudest distraction you can manage." Elizabeth nodded, her expression showing the same determined courage that had helped her survive mining camp violence and financial ruin. "What kind of distraction?" "Remember the signal fires Samuel mentioned for emergencies? There's lamp oil stored in the cellar, and the ventilation shaft leads directly outside. 300 seconds should give me time to position myself." The plan was desperate and dangerous, but it offered their only hope of evening the odds against 6 armed men who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. Margaret helped her mother navigate to the pantry, where the concealed trapdoor provided access to the underground storage area that had been designed as much for security as for food preservation. "Margaret," Elizabeth whispered as she prepared to descend into the cellar, Your father would be proud of the woman you've become." The words gave Margaret strength she didn't know she possessed. As she helped her mother disappear into the hidden space, she felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, not just for their survival, but for proving that courage could triumph over cruelty when guided by intelligence and determination. Outside, she could hear the fake marshals organizing their robbery with military precision. Their leader, the man who had called himself Patterson, was assigning specific tasks to his subordinates while Daniel and the ranch hands were being held under guard near the main corral. "Johnson, you and Martinez search the house for cash and valuables," Patterson commanded. "Williams, secure the bunkhouse and make sure none of the hands try anything heroic. The rest of you start gathering horses and cattle. We'll drive a small herd north to obscure our trail while the ladies prepare us a farewell meal." The casual mention of their participation in the criminals' plans sent ice through Margaret's veins. These men weren't planning a simple robbery. They intended to use the ranch as a base for extended operations. With her and Elizabeth as unwilling servants to their criminal enterprise, Margaret forced herself to remain calm as two of the robbers entered the kitchen, their weapons drawn and their expressions showing the kind of casual brutality that came from years of violence without consequence. The larger man, Johnson, was built like a lumberjack, but moved with the predatory grace of someone accustomed to intimidating others through physical presence alone. "Well, well," Johnson said with a grin that revealed missing teeth. "Looks like we've got ourselves a proper little housekeeper. Hope you can cook better than you can hide, sweetheart." "I was preparing a meal for the marshal's party," Margaret replied with forced meekness, allowing her voice to tremble slightly. "I could finish it if you'd like." "Smart girl," Martinez commented approvingly. He was smaller than his partner, but carried himself with the nervous energy of someone always ready for violence. "See, Johnson? Some folks understand cooperation." Margaret busied herself at the stove, outwardly compliant while internally counting seconds toward Elizabeth's planned distraction. The criminals' casual confidence was both infuriating and encouraging. They were so certain of their control that they weren't maintaining proper vigilance. "Where's the old lady in the wheelchair?" Johnson asked suddenly, his eyes scanning the kitchen and adjacent rooms. "She's resting in her bedroom," Margaret lied smoothly. The excitement upset her greatly. "She's quite frail since her accident." "Frail can be useful," Martinez observed with disturbing satisfaction. "Gives people extra motivation to cooperate when they know someone helpless might get hurt." The casual cruelty of the comment confirmed Margaret's worst fears about their captors' intentions. These weren't desperate men driven to crime by circumstances. They were predators who enjoyed inflicting suffering as much as they valued financial gain. Margaret continued her meal preparations while tracking the seconds in her mind. 240. 250. At 270 seconds, she began positioning herself near the cast-iron skillet that would serve as her primary weapon if Elizabeth's distraction proved successful. 290. 295. 300. The Kungi explosion that erupted from beneath the house was far more dramatic than Margaret had anticipated. Elizabeth had apparently combined lamp oil with some form of mining powder stored in the cellar, creating a blast that shook the entire structure and sent smoke billowing up through the floorboards and ventilation systems. "What the hell?" Johnson shouted, spinning toward the source of the explosion while Martinez dove for cover behind the kitchen table. Margaret didn't hesitate. The heavy cast-iron skillet caught Johnson across the temple with a sound like an axe biting into hardwood. He dropped like a felled tree, his weapon skittering across the floor toward the stove. Margaret snatched up the pistol while Martinez was still processing what had happened. "Don't move," she commanded with deadly seriousness, the gun trained on Martinez's center mass. "Put your hands where I can see them and keep them there." Martinez's eyes showed shock and rage at being outmaneuvered by a woman he had dismissed as harmless. "You little," I said, "don't move," Margaret interrupted coldly. "I've been shooting rabbits and deer since I was 12 years old. At this range, I won't miss." The truth was that Margaret had never shot anything larger than a squirrel, and had never aimed a weapon at another human being. But desperation and determination made her voice ring with convincing authority, and Martinez apparently decided not to test her resolve. Outside, the explosion had created exactly the chaos Elizabeth had intended. Shouts of confusion mixed with the sounds of panicking horses and the acrid smell of black powder smoke. Margaret could hear Daniel's voice raised in command, taking advantage of the distraction to rally his men against their captors. "Johnson's not moving," Martinez observed, his tone suggesting professional assessment rather than personal concern. "You killed him." Margaret glanced at the unconscious robber, noting the steady rise and fall of his chest. "He's breathing. But he'll have a headache when he wakes up." "You're making a mistake, lady," Martinez continued, his voice taking on a wheedling quality. "Patterson's got friends all over the territory. You let us go now, maybe he forgets about this place. But if you cause trouble—" "The only trouble here is you and your friends," Margaret replied firmly. "Now we're going outside, and you're going to tell your leader that his men are no longer in control of this situation." Through the kitchen window, Margaret could see that the explosion had indeed turned the tide of the confrontation. Several of the fake marshals were struggling to control their frightened horses, while Daniel and Samuel had managed to arm themselves and take cover behind the ranch's defensive positions. Most importantly, the carefully planned robbery had degenerated into the kind of chaotic gunfight that favored the defenders, who knew the terrain over the attackers who had lost the element of surprise. "Move," Margaret commanded, gesturing Martinez toward the door with Johnson's pistol. "Keep your hands visible and don't make any sudden movements." As they emerged from the house, Margaret was struck by the dramatic transformation of the ranch yard. What had been a peaceful pastoral scene 30 minutes earlier now resembled a battlefield, with armed men taking cover behind buildings and equipment while gunfire echoed across the valley. Patterson, the fake marshal leader, was crouched behind an overturned wagon, his earlier confident demeanor replaced by the desperate calculations of a man whose carefully planned operation had collapsed into disaster. When he saw Margaret emerge with his companion at gunpoint, his expression darkened with rage and disbelief. "Martinez, what the hell happened?" Patterson shouted across the yard. "The ladies happened, boss," Martinez called back, his voice carrying bitter acknowledgement of their tactical failure. "Turns out they're not as helpless as we figured." Daniel appeared from behind the main barn, his rifle trained on another of the robbers who had apparently been captured during the initial confusion. His eyes met Margaret's across the chaotic scene, and she saw pride and gratitude in his expression. That made her heart race with emotions she had no time to examine. "Patterson," Daniel called out with authority that carried clearly across the ranch yard, "your operation is finished. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial instead of hanging from the nearest tree." The fake marshal's response was a burst of gunfire directed at Daniel's position, confirming that he intended to fight rather than surrender. But the balance of power had shifted decisively in favor of the ranch defenders, and Margaret realized that their desperate gamble had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. As she secured Martinez and began moving toward Daniel's position, Margaret caught sight of Elizabeth emerging from the root cellar behind the house, her wheelchair navigating the rough terrain with determined efficiency despite the ongoing battle around her. The sight of her mother, supposedly frail and helpless, actively participating in their defense filled Margaret with fierce pride and renewed determination. They had proven that even the most desperate circumstances couldn't defeat people who refused to surrender their dignity and fought back with everything they possessed. The battle for Sweetwater Ranch was far from over, but the tide had turned in favor of those who had the most to lose and the greatest reason to fight. Margaret tightened her grip on the captured weapon and prepared to help finish what Elizabeth's explosive distraction had begun. The gunfight that followed Elizabeth's explosive gambit lasted only 12 minutes, but those 12 minutes would reshape every relationship and assumption that had governed life at Sweetwater Ranch. Margaret found herself moving through the chaos with a clarity of purpose that surprised her, every decision driven by the fierce protective instinct that had awakened when she realized their new family was under mortal threat. With Martinez secured and Johnson unconscious in the kitchen, Margaret made her way toward Daniel's position behind the main barn, using the ranch buildings for cover while keeping her captured weapon trained on any movement that might represent continuing danger. The acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with the familiar sense of hay and livestock, creating a surreal contrast between violence and the peaceful ranch life they had been building. "Daniel," she called out as she approached his defensive position. "Johnson's down, Martinez is captured. How many are still fighting?" "3, maybe 4, Daniel replied without taking his eyes off the overturned wagon, where Patterson and his remaining men had taken cover. Williams ran for the horses when the shooting started. He might be organizing a retreat or preparing a flanking attack. Samuel Rodriguez appeared from behind the equipment shed, his weathered face grim with the kind of determination that came from protecting something precious. "Miss Margaret, your mother's asking for you. She's got some kind of plan, but she needs to explain it directly." The mention of Elizabeth sent alarm through Margaret's system. Her mother had already risked everything with the explosive distraction. What additional danger was she contemplating? "Where is she?" "Behind the house, near the root cellar entrance," Samuel replied. "She's got supplies spread out like she's preparing for a siege." Margaret looked toward Daniel, seeking guidance about whether she should leave her position during an active firefight. His expression showed the internal conflict between protecting her from danger and recognizing that Elizabeth's strategic thinking had already proven crucial to their survival. "Go," Daniel decided, "but stay low and keep to cover. If shooting starts up again, get to the cellar and stay there until it's over." Margaret nodded and began making her way toward the back of the house, using outbuildings and equipment for concealment while the sporadic gunfire continued from the main confrontation area. She found Elizabeth positioned behind a makeshift barricade of furniture and supply crates, with an array of materials spread around her wheelchair that looked like the inventory of a military quartermaster. "Mama, what are you doing?" Margaret asked as she settled beside her mother's defensive position. Elizabeth's eyes were bright with the kind of focused energy that Margaret remembered from their boarding house days, when her mother would organize complex operations while maintaining perfect composure under pressure. "I'm preparing for the possibility that this fight isn't over, even if we win this round." "What do you mean?" "Think about it, sweetheart," Elizabeth said while checking the loads in several pistols she had apparently retrieved from unconscious attackers. "These men didn't come here randomly. Someone directed them to this ranch specifically, and that someone is still out there." The implication sent ice through Margaret's veins. They had been so focused on surviving the immediate attack that they hadn't considered the larger conspiracy that might have organized it. "You think Morrison or Whitfield hired them?" "I think this was supposed to look like a robbery that went wrong, leaving Daniel dead and the ranch vulnerable to foreclosure proceedings," Elizabeth replied with chilling logic. "When these men don't return on schedule, their employers will know the plan failed. They'll try something else." Margaret absorbed this analysis while listening to the continuing gunfire from the front of the ranch. Her mother's strategic thinking was proving as valuable as her courage, but it also revealed dangers that extended far beyond the current battle. "What do you suggest we do?" Elizabeth gestured toward the supplies she had organized. "First, we make sure Daniel and his men have everything they need to finish this fight decisively. Then we start planning for whatever comes next." As if summoned by their conversation, the intensity of gunfire from the main battle suddenly increased. with rapid exchanges that suggested either a final assault or a desperate breakout attempt. Margaret could hear Daniel's voice shouting commands, mixed with the sounds of running horses and men calling to each other across the ranch yard. "I need to get back to Daniel," Margaret said, checking her weapon and preparing to return to the fight. "Wait," Elizabeth commanded, grabbing her daughter's arm with surprising strength. "Take these." She pressed additional ammunition and a second pistol into Margaret's hands. "And remember, you're not just fighting for survival anymore. You're fighting for the life we've built here." The words carried weight that went beyond simple survival. Margaret realized that Sweetwater Ranch had become more than employment or shelter. It had become home in a way that transcended practical arrangements. Daniel Samuel, the ranch hands. Even the land itself had become family worth defending against any threat. Margaret made her way back toward the main battle, finding that the situation had evolved significantly during her brief absence. Patterson and his remaining men had attempted a breakout toward their horses, but Samuel and several ranch hands had anticipated the maneuver and cut off their escape route. Now the surviving robbers were trapped in a crossfire between Daniel's position and the defensive line Samuel had established near the corral. "Surrender now, and we'll let you live to stand trial," Daniel called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Keep fighting, and we'll finish this the hard way." Patterson's response was a string of profanity followed by more gunfire, confirming his intention to fight rather than face justice for his crimes. But Margaret could see that his position was hopeless, outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded by men who were fighting to protect their home rather than simply following orders. The end came with startling suddenness. Williams, the robber who had tried to escape earlier, reappeared from behind the barn with his hands raised, apparently having decided that surrender offered better prospects than continued resistance. His capitulation seemed to break the spirit of the remaining fighters, and within minutes, Patterson and his last companion were also laying down their weapons. "It's over," Daniel announced, his voice carrying across the ranch yard with quiet satisfaction. "Samuel, secure the prisoners. Margaret, check on the wounded. Everyone else, start assessing damage and collecting weapons." As the immediate crisis ended, Margaret found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. The combination of terror, rage, and fierce protective love that had sustained her through the battle was slowly giving way to exhaustion and something that felt like profound relief. She was checking Johnson's head wound. He was still unconscious but breathing steadily when Daniel appeared beside her, his own expression showing the same mixture of exhaustion and emotional intensity that she was experiencing. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries with the focused attention of someone who had been genuinely afraid for her safety. "I'm fine," Margaret replied, though she realized her hands were shaking as the adrenaline began to fade. "Are you?" "Bruised and battered, but whole," Daniel answered. Then, with an expression she had never seen from him before, he added quietly, "Margaret, what you and your mother did today, I've never seen anything like it. You saved all our lives." The praise should have felt good, but instead it made Margaret aware of how fundamentally their relationship had changed. They were no longer employer and employee, or even friends helping each other through difficult circumstances. They had become something deeper, people who had fought together for something they both valued more than their own safety. "We were fighting for our family," Margaret said simply, the words emerging before she had consciously decided to speak them. Daniel's expression intensified at her use of the word family. For a moment, the careful emotional distance he had maintained since his wife's death seemed to waver, revealing the depth of feeling he had been suppressing. "Margaret," he began, then stopped as Elizabeth's voice called from behind the house. "Daniel, Margaret, come quickly, we have company." They hurried toward Elizabeth's position, finding her pointing toward the valley road where a substantial group of riders was approaching the ranch. Margaret's heart sank as she counted at least A dozen men, moving with the organized precision that suggested either military or law enforcement, or potentially more criminals arriving to finish what Patterson's group had started. "Who are they?" Margaret asked, exhaustion making her voice sound hollow. Daniel studied the approaching riders through a small telescope, his expression cycling through concern, confusion, and finally relief. "It's Sheriff Collins from Sweetwater, with what looks like a territorial marshal and a federal judge. Someone must have heard the gunfire and sent for official help." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Real law enforcement was arriving just as they had finished dealing with fake marshals, whose criminal enterprise had nearly destroyed everything they cared about. But Margaret realized that official investigation might create its own complications, particularly if corruption in the territorial government was as extensive as Elizabeth suspected. "Daniel," she said urgently, "before they get here, we need to decide how much to tell them about Morrison and Whitfield's involvement. If there's official corruption, we might be putting ourselves in more danger." Daniel nodded grimly, understanding the implications. "We'll stick to the facts about the immediate attack and let them draw their own conclusions about broader conspiracies. But we'll need to be prepared for more trouble if our suspicions are correct." As the official party reached the ranch buildings, Margaret realized that surviving the robbers' attack had been only the first test of their new family strength. The greater challenge would be navigating the political and legal complications that were about to descend upon Sweetwater Ranch, while protecting the bonds they had forged in blood and fire from those who might see their unity as a threat to established power structures. Federal Judge William Porter proved to be a man whose physical presence commanded respect even before he spoke. Tall and silver-haired, with penetrating blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the scene before him, he dismounted from his horse with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to arriving at places where justice hung in the balance. Sheriff Collins, a younger man with the weathered face of someone who had spent years mediating disputes in frontier communities, immediately began organizing the scene with professional efficiency. His deputy secured the prisoners while he examined the evidence of the battle that had raged across the ranch yard. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Porter said formally, removing his hat as he approached Daniel, "I understand you've had some excitement here today." "Your Honor," Daniel replied with equal formality, though Margaret noticed tension in his posture that suggested wariness about official involvement. "We were attacked by men claiming to be federal marshals pursuing bank robbers. They turned out to be the criminals themselves." Judge Porter's expression remained neutral as he absorbed this information. "How did you determine they weren't legitimate? Law enforcement?" Margaret stepped forward before Daniel could respond, driven by an instinct that the truth was their best protection, even if it revealed uncomfortable realities about territorial politics. "Your Honor, my mother identified inconsistencies in their behavior and questioning that suggested reconnaissance rather than law enforcement activity." "Your mother?" Porter's attention focused on Elizabeth, who was positioned near her makeshift defensive position, still surrounded by the supplies she had organized during the battle. "Mrs. Chun, I'd be interested in your observations." Elizabeth wheeled herself forward with dignified composure, her sharp eyes meeting the judge's gaze directly. "Your Honor, I operated a boarding house for 15 years. You learn to read people quickly in that business, especially when they might be dangerous to your other guests. These men were assessing our defenses and resources, not following a criminal trail. Specifically, what made you suspicious?" They asked detailed questions about cattle numbers, seasonal routines, and ranch finances, Elizabeth replied without hesitation. "Information irrelevant to catching fugitives, but essential for planning a robbery or evaluating assets for acquisition." Judge Porter absorbed this analysis with the focused attention of someone accustomed to weighing evidence carefully. Sheriff Collins, meanwhile, was examining the weapons and supplies scattered around the battle site with professional interest. "Judge," Collins called from near the overturned wagon where Patterson had made his stand, These men were carrying more ammunition than any legitimate pursuit would require. Looks like they were planning an extended operation. Margaret watched the exchange between official investigators with growing anxiety. The questions were reasonable and professional, but she remained uncertain about how much to reveal regarding their suspicions about Morrison and Whitfield's involvement. Elizabeth's warning about corruption in territorial government made every response feel like a calculated risk. "Mr. Harrison," Judge Porter continued, "had you received any threats or warnings that might have made you a target for criminal activity?" Daniel hesitated, clearly wrestling with the same concerns that troubled Margaret. "Your Honor, we've had some business pressures recently. Neighbors interested in acquiring our water rights and aggressive lending offers from the local bank. Nothing explicitly threatening, but persistent enough to create unease." The carefully diplomatic answer managed to acknowledge suspicious activities without making direct accusations that might prove dangerous if the wrong people were listening. Judge Porter's expression suggested he understood the subtext of Daniel's response. "I see. And these business pressures involved which parties specifically?" Before Daniel could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Margaret turned to see a familiar figure riding hard toward the ranch. James Morrison, the banker who had made the suspicious loan offer weeks earlier. His arrival at the scene of a criminal attack seemed far too convenient to be coincidental. "Judge Porter," Morrison called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the forced joviality that Margaret had learned to distrust. "Thank God you're here. I heard there was trouble at the Harrison Ranch and came as quickly as I could." "Mr. Morrison," Judge Porter replied neutrally, "what's your interest in this matter?" "Daniel's been a valued customer for years," Morrison replied, though his eyes were scanning the scene with what appeared to be professional assessment rather than personal concern. "When I heard about the attack, I wanted to ensure he had access to emergency financing for any damages or security improvements." Margaret felt her mother's sharp intake of breath and glanced toward Elizabeth, whose expression had grown coldly analytical. The timing of Morrison's arrival, combined with his immediate offer of financial assistance, created a pattern that suggested foreknowledge of the attack. "That's thoughtful of you, James," Daniel said carefully, "but we haven't assessed damages yet, and I'm not sure additional financing would be appropriate at this time." Morrison's smile became slightly strained. Of course. But if circumstances change, my investors remain interested in supporting successful operations like yours." Judge Porter had been observing this exchange with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize significant subtleties. "Mr. Morrison, you mentioned investors. Are these the same parties you've been discussing with Mr. Harrison previously?" "Various business associates from back east," Morrison replied vaguely. "Always looking for profitable opportunities in developing territories." Elizabeth cleared her throat politely, drawing attention to herself with the measured timing of someone preparing to make an important point. "Mr. Morrison, I'm curious about the timing of your arrival. How did you learn about the attack so quickly?" Morrison's expression flickered with what might have been annoyance before returning to practice charm. "News travels fast in small communities. Mrs. Chun, Sheriff Collins sent word to town about the emergency, and naturally I was concerned about Daniel's welfare." "Naturally," Elizabeth agreed pleasantly, though her tone carried undertones that suggested skepticism. "It's fortunate you were available to respond so quickly. I assume your business associates will be pleased to hear that the attack was unsuccessful." The comment was delivered with such diplomatic politeness that it took Morrison a moment to recognize its implications. When understanding dawned, his expression hardened briefly before returning to forced geniality. "I'm sure everyone in the community is relieved that no one was seriously injured," Morrison replied stiffly. Judge Porter had been following this verbal sparring with obvious interest. "Mrs. Chen, are you suggesting some connection between Mr. Morrison's business activities and today's attack?" Elizabeth wheeled her chair closer to the judge, her expression becoming grave. "Your Honor, I'm suggesting that the timing of aggressive lending offers, followed by criminal attacks, followed by immediate offers of emergency financing, creates a pattern worthy of investigation." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a poorly ventilated fire. Morrison's face reddened with what appeared to be genuine anger, though Margaret couldn't determine whether his reaction reflected outrage at false accusations or fury at being exposed. "That's a serious allegation, Mrs. Chun," Judge Porter said quietly. "Do you have evidence to support such claims?" "I have the business experience to recognize predatory lending patterns when I see them," Elizabeth replied firmly. 12%. Interest rates, pressure for immediate decisions, and systematic attempts to destabilize successful operations through external pressure. Sheriff Collins looked up from his examination of the prisoners, his expression showing professional interest in the developing accusations. "Judge, might be worth noting that these robbers were carrying territorial banknotes, unusual for drifters to have local currency in quantity." The observation added another piece to a puzzle that was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly dangerous. If Morrison was indeed connected to the attack, then their survival had made them targets for retaliation from enemies with both financial resources and official connections. Daniel stepped closer to Judge Porter, his voice low but carrying across the group. "Your Honor, if there's official corruption involved in territorial banking or land acquisition, we need federal protection. These attacks won't stop just because we defended ourselves successfully once." Judge Porter nodded gravely. "Mr. Harrison, based on what I've observed here, I'm prepared to initiate a federal investigation into territorial banking practices and potential conspiracy to defraud legitimate property owners. But I'll need detailed statements from all of you, and you'll need to be prepared for the possibility that fighting corruption might be more dangerous than surviving criminal attacks." Margaret felt a chill at the judge's warning. They had survived one battle, but they were apparently about to enter a war against enemies who possessed wealth, political connections, and the patient ruthlessness to orchestrate systematic destruction of anyone who opposed them. "What do you need from us?" she asked, her voice steady despite her fears. "Complete honesty about everything you've observed and suspected," Judge Porter replied, "and the courage to testify publicly when the time comes, knowing that powerful people will do everything possible to discredit or intimidate you." As Margaret looked around at the ranch that had become home, the man who had become family, and the mother whose strength had saved them all, she realized that their greatest test was just beginning. They had proven they could fight desperately when their lives were threatened. Now they would discover whether they possessed the different kind of courage required to fight patiently against enemies who preferred legal weapons to bullets, and who had turned corruption into an art form. The battle for Sweetwater Ranch was over. The war for justice was about to begin, and the stakes were nothing less than the future of everyone they loved and everything they had worked to build together. 3 weeks after the attack, Sweetwater Ranch had settled into a deceptive calm that masked the seismic changes occurring beneath its peaceful surface. The physical evidence of the battle had been cleared away, the prisoners had been transferred to federal custody, and life had resumed its daily rhythms of cattle management and household duties. But nothing was truly the same, and everyone knew it. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Daniel work with a group of young horses in the main corral, her hands automatically kneading bread dough while her mind processed the complex emotions that had been building since the day they fought together for their lives. The careful professional distance that had once defined their relationship had been shattered by shared danger, replaced by something deeper and more complicated that neither of them seemed ready to acknowledge directly. "You're going to work that dough to death if you're not careful," Elizabeth observed from her position at the kitchen table, where she was organizing correspondence related to Judge Porter's ongoing investigation. Her tone was gently teasing, but her eyes showed the same concern that had been growing as she watched her daughter struggle with feelings that were clearly beyond simple. Employer-employee attachment. I was just thinking, Margaret replied, forcing herself to focus on the bread preparation. About Daniel, Elizabeth said matter-of-factly. You've been just thinking about him quite a lot lately. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she couldn't deny the accuracy of her mother's observation. Ever since the attack, she had found herself hyper-aware of Daniel's presence, noting details about his expressions and mannerisms that went far beyond professional interest. When he was away from the ranch on business, she felt anxious until his return. When he was present, she felt a mixture of contentment and nervous energy that made concentration difficult. "Mama, it's complicated," Margaret said finally, abandoning the pretense that her feelings were purely professional. "Love usually is," Elizabeth replied with the practical wisdom of someone who had navigated her own share of romantic complications. "The question is whether you're prepared to do something about it, or whether you're going to torture yourself with uncertainty indefinitely." Before Margaret could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the window. A lone rider was making his way up the valley road toward the ranch, not the urgent pace of emergency, but the steady gait of someone on routine business. As the figure drew closer, Margaret recognized Dr. Patterson from Sweetwater, the physician who had treated the minor injuries sustained during the attack. "That's Dr. Patterson," Margaret announced, wiping her hands on her apron and preparing to greet their visitor. "Unexpected medical calls usually mean someone's hurt," Elizabeth observed, her expression showing immediate concern. "I hope it's not serious." Daniel had apparently noticed the doctor's arrival as well, because he was walking toward the house from the corral, his expression showing the same concern that Elizabeth had voiced. Margaret met both men at the front door, her heart rate elevated by fears about potential medical emergencies. "Dr. Patterson," Daniel said formally, "what brings you out to the ranch today?" The doctor was a man in his 50s with the kind of gentle competence that came from years of treating everything from childhood ailments to mining accidents. His expression was serious, but not grim, suggesting important news rather than medical crisis. "Daniel, Margaret," Dr. Patterson nodded to both of them. "I have information about the investigation that Judge Porter thought you should hear directly." They gathered in the main sitting room, where Elizabeth joined them with her characteristic directness. "Doctor, what kind of information?" Dr. Patterson settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone preparing to deliver complex news. "Judge Porter's federal investigation has uncovered evidence of a conspiracy that extends far beyond territorial banking. We're dealing with organized criminal activity involving land acquisition, mineral rights fraud, and systematic intimidation of legitimate property owners." Daniel leaned forward intently. "How extensive is this conspiracy?" "At least a dozen territorial officials, 3 major banking institutions, and several Eastern investment groups," Dr. Patterson replied grimly. "Your ranch was targeted because your water rights and grazing lands are essential for a much larger development scheme." Margaret felt the familiar chill of recognition that accompanied revelations about enemies whose plans were more sophisticated than she had imagined. "What kind of development scheme?" "Railroad construction," Dr. Patterson explained. "There are plans for a major rail line connecting Montana to the eastern markets, with significant federal subsidies for land acquisition. The conspirators have been systematically acquiring properties along the proposed route, often through fraudulent means." Elizabeth's sharp intake of breath was audible. If they control the entire corridor, they could manipulate federal contracts and land grants worth millions of dollars. "Exactly," Dr. Patterson confirmed. "Your ranch sits in the middle of a crucial section of the route. Without access to your water rights and grazing lands, their entire scheme becomes much less profitable." Daniel stood and began pacing, his agitation evident as he processed the implications of this information. "So the attack wasn't just about robbing us. It was about creating conditions for forced sale or foreclosure. That's Judge Porter's conclusion." Dr. Patterson agreed. Morrison's banking practices, Whitfield's harassment, and the criminal attack were all coordinated efforts to drive you off your land. Margaret found herself experiencing a mixture of vindication and terror. Their suspicions had been correct, but the scope of the conspiracy was far greater than they had imagined. "Are we still in danger?" Dr. Patterson's expression grew grave. "Judge Porter believes so. The conspirators have too much invested in this scheme to abandon it simply because one attack failed. They'll likely try different approaches, possibly, including legal challenges to your land titles or attempts to manipulate local politics. What does Judge Porter recommend?" Elizabeth asked pragmatically. "Federal marshals will be stationed discreetly in the area for the next several months." Dr. Patterson replied, "But he also suggests that you consider alternative arrangements for your personal safety." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality that they were being advised to flee their home for their own protection. Margaret felt a surge of defiant anger at the suggestion that criminals could drive them away from the life they had worked so hard to build. "We're not running," she said firmly, surprising herself with the vehemence of her declaration. "This is our home, and we're not going to be driven away by threats and intimidation." Daniel stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression that combined admiration with deep concern. "Margaret, I appreciate your courage, but we need to be realistic about the dangers involved. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to use violence." "Then we'll be prepared for violence," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear that accompanied her words. "We've proven we can defend ourselves when necessary." Elizabeth had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, her business mind clearly working through the strategic implications of their situation. "Dr. Patterson, what timeline are we dealing with? How long before the conspirators are likely to make their next move?" "Judge Porter estimates we have perhaps 6 weeks before they feel compelled to take action," Dr. Patterson replied. "The railroad investors are expecting progress reports, and continued delays will eventually expose the conspiracy." 6 weeks, Daniel repeated thoughtfully. "Enough time to prepare better defenses, but not enough time for federal prosecution to provide permanent protection." Margaret found herself studying Daniel's profile as he considered their options, noting the determined set of his jaw and the protective instincts that were evident in his posture. The realization struck her with startling clarity that she wasn't just willing to fight for their ranch. She was willing to fight for the man who had shown her what it meant to be valued and trusted. "Daniel," she said quietly, drawing his attention, "whatever we decide to do, we should decide together. As a family." The word hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond their current crisis. Daniel's expression intensified as he met her gaze, and Margaret saw recognition of her deeper meaning reflected in his eyes. "Margaret," he said softly, then stopped as though uncertain how to continue. Elizabeth cleared her throat gently, her expression showing the kind of understanding that came from years of observing human nature. "Dr. Patterson, thank you for bringing us this information. Would you be able to stay for dinner? I'm sure Daniel and Margaret have additional questions about the investigation." The doctor accepted graciously, apparently unaware of the emotional undercurrents he had interrupted. As he and Elizabeth began discussing the technical details of federal prosecution procedures, Margaret and Daniel found themselves standing near the window, ostensibly looking out at the ranch landscape, but actually struggling with the weight of unspoken feelings. "Margaret," Daniel said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "when this crisis is over, we need to talk about changes in our arrangement here." Margaret's heart began racing as she tried to interpret his meaning. "What kind of changes?" Daniel turned to face her directly, his expression showing vulnerability that she had rarely seen from him. "The kind that acknowledge that you and Elizabeth have become far more than employees. The kind that recognize that what we've built here is worth protecting, not just as a business, but as something much more precious. Before Margaret could respond, Dr. Patterson's voice interrupted their private conversation. "Daniel, there's one more thing Judge Porter wanted me to discuss with you. He's received information that suggests the next phase of the conspiracy might involve attempts to manipulate local politics and law enforcement." The warning brought them back to the immediate reality of their dangerous situation. But Margaret carried Daniel's words with her as they rejoined the larger conversation. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she now knew that their relationship had evolved beyond simple professional arrangements into something that justified the risks they were about to face. The conspiracy against them was vast and powerful, but the bonds they had forged through shared danger and mutual respect might prove stronger than their enemies imagined. As evening approached and Dr. Patterson prepared to return to town, Margaret realized that the next 6 weeks would determine not just their physical survival, but the future of relationships that had become more precious than the land they were fighting to protect. The final confrontation came not with gunfire and explosions, but with something far more powerful: the quiet courage of truth spoken in a federal courtroom, where justice could no longer be bought or intimidated. 6 weeks after Dr. Patterson's warning, Margaret found herself standing before Judge Porter in the territorial capital, her hand resting on a Bible as she prepared to give testimony that would either destroy the conspiracy, threatening their home, or make her family permanent targets of men with unlimited resources and patience. "Miss Chun," Judge Porter said formally, though his eyes showed the respect that had grown during weeks of careful investigation, "please tell the court about your observations regarding the systematic campaign to acquire Sweetwater Ranch through fraudulent means." Margaret looked across the packed courtroom, noting the expensive suits and hostile expressions of men whose carefully constructed conspiracy was about to be exposed. Morrison sat at the defendant's table with his lawyers, his face a mask of controlled fury. Whitfield was beside him, along with 3 territorial officials and 2 railroad investors whose involvement had been uncovered through meticulous federal investigation. "Your Honor," Margaret began, her voice steady despite the weight of knowing that her words could determine the future of everyone she loved. The pattern began with aggressive lending offers designed to create artificial financial pressure. When those failed, it escalated to criminal violence intended to force abandonment of the property. The testimony that followed was detailed and devastating. Elizabeth, despite her wheelchair, commanded the courtroom with the authority of someone who had spent years managing complex business operations. Her analysis of the conspiracy's financial structure was so thorough that even the defendant's lawyers struggled to challenge her conclusions. Daniel's testimony focused on the practical impacts of the intimidation campaign, but Margaret noticed that his eyes kept returning to her throughout his time on the witness stand. The man who had hired her as a desperate solution to his household management problems now looked at her with the kind of respect and affection that made her heart race despite the serious nature of their surroundings. The defense attorney's cross-examination was brutal but ultimately futile. Elizabeth's business experience and Margaret's attention to detail had created a record of evidence that was simply too comprehensive to discredit. When federal investigators testified about the railroad development scheme and the millions of dollars in fraudulent contracts that had been discovered, the conspiracy's scope became impossible to deny. Judge Porter's verdict was swift and comprehensive. Morrison received 15 years in federal prison for fraud and conspiracy. Whitfield was sentenced to 10 years for his role in the land acquisition scheme. The territorial officials faced removal from office and criminal prosecution, while the railroad investors forfeited their contracts and faced massive financial penalties. But the real victory came in Judge Porter's final pronouncement. The federal government recognizes the legitimate ownership of the Harrison family ranch and declares all claims against the property to be fraudulent and without merit. Federal protection will remain in place until all appeals are exhausted and all conspirators are in custody. As they emerged from the courthouse into the brilliant Montana sunshine, Margaret felt a profound sense of completion that went beyond simple legal victory. The conspiracy that had threatened their home was destroyed, but more importantly, the bonds forged through shared danger had proven strong enough to withstand every test that had been placed before them. "It's over," Daniel said quietly, his voice carrying wonder, as though he couldn't quite believe their ordeal had ended in triumph rather than tragedy. "The legal part is over," Elizabeth corrected with gentle wisdom. "Now comes the more important work of deciding what kind of life we want to build with the security we've earned." Margaret understood immediately what her mother meant. The crisis that had brought them together was resolved, but the relationships that had developed through shared struggle now needed to be redefined for peacetime. The question that had been postponed by immediate danger could no longer be avoided. What were they to each other when survival was no longer the primary concern? The conversation that followed took place that evening on the porch of Sweetwater Ranch, with the three people who had become family watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple that seemed to celebrate their victory over forces that had tried to destroy everything they valued. "Margaret," Daniel said, his voice carrying the hesitation of a man who had spent 3 years avoiding emotional vulnerability, "I need to say something that I should have said weeks ago." Margaret felt her pulse quicken, but she remained silent, sensing that this was a moment that had been building since the day she first helped him fight for their home. "When I hired you and Elizabeth, I thought I was solving a practical problem," Daniel continued, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains, as though the landscape could provide courage for what he needed to say. "I had no idea I was inviting two extraordinary women to transform my understanding of what it means to have a family." Elizabeth smiled knowingly, her expression showing the satisfaction of someone whose careful observations had proven correct. "Daniel, I think my daughter has something she'd like to say as well." Margaret took a deep breath, realizing that the moment had arrived when she could either embrace the future that was being offered or retreat into the safety of familiar roles and boundaries. The choice felt as significant as any decision she had made since arriving at Sweetwater Ranch. "Daniel," she said, her voice stronger than she had expected, "what I want to say is that I love you. Not as an employee grateful for employment, or as someone dependent on your protection, but as a woman who has found a man worthy of respect, trust, and complete devotion." The words hung in the evening air between them, carrying weight that transformed everything about their relationship in a single moment. Daniel's expression showed surprise, wonder, and something that looked very much like relief. "Margaret," he replied, moving closer to her chair, "I love you too. I've been fighting that feeling for months, telling myself it was inappropriate or premature or complicated by our circumstances. But the truth is that you've brought life back to this ranch and to my heart in ways I never thought possible after losing Sarah and my wife." Before Margaret could respond, Daniel dropped to one knee beside her chair, his weathered hands taking hers with the gentleness of someone handling something precious beyond measure. "Miss Margaret Chun," he said formally, his voice carrying across the porch with the authority of a man who had made an irrevocable decision, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not as a solution to practical problems, but as the woman I want to spend the rest of my life loving and protecting and building dreams with?" Margaret felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she absorbed the reality that the desperate journey that had begun with her mother's accident was culminating in an offer of love from a man she respected more than anyone she had ever known. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Daniel Harrison, I will marry you. And I will spend every day of our marriage proving myself worthy of the trust you've placed in me." Elizabeth's applause from her wheelchair was enthusiastic and prolonged, her joy at witnessing her daughter's happiness evident in every gesture. "Well," she announced with satisfaction, "I suppose that settles the question of permanent employment arrangements." The laughter that followed was rich with happiness and relief, but also with the deeper satisfaction that came from surviving genuine danger and emerging stronger than they had been individually. As Daniel slipped his mother's wedding ring onto Margaret's finger, a ring that had been preserved for the right woman despite years of grief and isolation, Margaret realized that their story had become something larger than a tale of survival. Against criminal conspiracy, they had proven that family bonds could be chosen rather than inherited, that love could develop from respect and shared values rather than simple attraction, and that courage in the face of overwhelming odds could transform desperate circumstances into foundations for extraordinary happiness. The wedding took place 6 months later in the same church where Daniel's parents had been married 40 years earlier. Judge Porter performed the ceremony, having become not just their legal protector, but a genuine friend, whose respect for their courage had evolved into deep personal affection. Elizabeth served as matron of honor, her dignity and strength in her wheelchair serving as inspiration to everyone present. Samuel Rodriguez walked Margaret down the aisle in place of the father she had lost, his weathered face showing pride in the woman who had proven herself worthy of the family he had served for so many years. The reception was held at Sweetwater Ranch, where neighbors who had initially been suspicious of the arrangements between a widowed rancher and two desperate women now celebrated a love story that had become legendary throughout the territory. The Chinese woman who couldn't walk and her daughter who had been rejected by potential suitors elsewhere had found not just acceptance but genuine celebration in a community that had learned to value character over conventional expectations. As Margaret danced with her new husband under stars that seemed to bless their union, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. The desperate plea that had begun their story, "My mama can't walk anymore, can you help her, rancher?" had been answered in ways that none of them could have imagined. Daniel had indeed carried them both home, but in the process they had carried him home as well, to a life filled with purpose, love, and the kind of family bonds that could withstand any storm. The weight of mountains that had once threatened to crush their spirits now stood as eternal guardians around their happiness, protecting a love that had been forged in crisis and tempered by shared courage. The ranch that had been a refuge had become a foundation for generations of happiness yet to come. And three people who had begun as strangers united only by desperation had become family in the truest sense, bound not by blood or convenience, but by the unbreakable bonds of chosen love, mutual respect, and faith in each other that had proven stronger than any force that had tried to destroy them. Their story would be told and retold throughout the Montana Territory as proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simplest acts of kindness, and that real families are built not through shared genetics, but through shared courage in the face of whatever challenges life might bring. The rancher had indeed carried them both home, and in doing so, had found his own way back to the kind of happiness he had thought lost forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.